Sarah Martinez had always been underestimated. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 130 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a combat instructor at Fort Bragg. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes held a quiet intensity that most people missed entirely. What they saw was a small woman trying to make it in a man's world. What they didn't see was the steel underneath. She had grown up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, where survival meant learning to fight before you learned to read properly. Her father, a former Marine, had taught her that size didn't matter if you knew how to use leverage and speed to your advantage. By the time she was 12, she could take down boys twice her size. By 18, she had earned a black belt in 3 different martial arts disciplines. The Army had been her escape route from a life that promised nothing but dead ends. She enlisted right after high school, determined to prove that she belonged among the best. After 8 years of service, she had worked her way up to staff sergeant and earned a position as a hand-to-hand combat instructor. It was a role that put her in front of tough soldiers every day, men and women who initially looked at her with skepticism that gradually turned to respect. But Commander Jake Harrison was different. He was a Navy SEAL with 15 years of experience, a man who had seen combat in 3 different war zones and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been defeated. At 6 feet 2 inches and 220 pounds of solid muscle, he was exactly what people pictured when they thought of an elite warrior. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Harrison had arrived at Fort Bragg as part of a joint training exercise between the Army and Navy Special Operations units. The program was designed to share techniques and improve cooperation between the branches, but everyone knew it was really about proving who was tougher. The SEALs came in with an attitude that said they were the best of the best, and everyone else was just playing soldier. From the moment Harrison walked into her training facility, Sarah could feel the tension in the air. He looked around the room with barely concealed disdain, his eyes sweeping over the equipment and techniques she had set up for the demonstration. When his gaze finally settled on her, she saw something that made her jaw tighten. It wasn't just skepticism or surprise, it was dismissal, pure and simple. He had already decided she wasn't worth his time. The other soldiers in the room picked up on it immediately. There were about 100 men and women gathered for the joint training session, a mix of Army Rangers, Green Berets, and regular infantry, along with Harrison's SEAL team. The Army soldiers knew Sarah's reputation and respected her abilities, but the SEALs were newcomers. They saw what Harrison saw, a small woman who looked out of place among warriors. Sarah had dealt with this kind of attitude before, but something about Harrison's casual dismissal got under her skin. Maybe it was the way he whispered something to one of his teammates that made the man chuckle. Maybe it was the way he checked his watch as if he had better places to be. Or maybe it was just that she was tired of having to prove herself over and over again to men who thought they knew everything about combat. She started the session by explaining basic grappling techniques, demonstrating holds and escapes on volunteers from the crowd. Harrison stood in the back with his arms crossed, not participating, but not leaving either. When she called for questions, he raised his hand with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "These techniques might work in training, but what happens when you're facing someone with real combat experience? Someone who's been in actual life or death situations?" The room went quiet. Sarah felt every eye on her, waiting to see how she would respond. She had heard variations of this question countless times, but never delivered with quite so much condescension. Harrison wasn't asking out of genuine curiosity. He was challenging her authority in front of her peers and subordinates. "That's a fair question, Commander," she replied, keeping her voice level. "Would you like to help me demonstrate?" Harrison's smirk widened. "Sure, I'd be happy to." As he made his way to the front of the room, Sarah could hear the murmur of voices from the crowd. Some of the Army soldiers looked worried for her. The SEALs looked entertained, as if they were about to watch their commander teach a lesson to an overconfident instructor. Harrison himself moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost a fight that mattered. "What did you have in mind, ma'am?" he asked as he reached the center of the training mat. Sarah studied him for a moment, taking in his stance, his muscle distribution, the way he carried himself. She had learned long ago to read opponents quickly, to find their strengths and weaknesses in the first few seconds of contact. Harrison was strong, no question about that. He was also experienced and confident, but confidence could be a weakness if it made you careless. "Let's start simple," she said. "I'll show the class how to escape from a bear hug. You grab me from behind, full strength. Don't hold back because I'm smaller. Treat it like a real combat situation." Harrison nodded, still smirking. "Yes, ma'am." He moved behind her and wrapped his powerful arms around her torso, pinning her arms to her sides. His grip was like a steel band, and Sarah could feel the raw strength in his muscles. A normal person would have panicked, would have struggled uselessly against that overwhelming force. But Sarah wasn't normal. Instead of fighting the hold, she relaxed for just a moment, feeling for the exact positioning of his arms and body. Then, in one fluid motion, she dropped her weight, shifted her hips, and drove her elbow back into his solar plexus, while simultaneously stepping on his instep with her heel. The combination broke his grip and sent him staggering backward, gasping for air. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs, but Sarah wasn't done. As Harrison recovered and tried to reset, she could see something different in his eyes. The smirk was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a man who had just realized he might be in a real fight. "Again," she said simply. This time, Harrison was more careful. He approached slowly, hands up in a fighting stance, no longer treating this as a demonstration. But Sarah had spent years studying larger, stronger opponents. She knew that their size was often their weakness, making them slower to change direction, harder to recover when their balance was disrupted. Harrison threw a straight punch, fast and powerful. Sarah slipped to the side and grabbed his extended arm, using his own momentum against him. Before he could react, she had him in an arm bar, applying just enough pressure to let him know she could break his elbow if she wanted to. He tapped out immediately, and she released him. The room was completely silent now, the earlier murmurs replaced by shocked attention. Harrison stood up, rubbing his shoulder, and for the first time since he had arrived, he looked at Sarah with something approaching respect. "Good technique," he admitted grudgingly. But Sarah could see it in his eyes. This wasn't over. Harrison was the kind of man who didn't like being shown up, especially not in front of his team. He would want another chance, and next time he wouldn't underestimate her. She had won the first round, but she had also made an enemy. The rest of the training session proceeded without incident. Harrison participated more actively, asking legitimate questions about technique and application. But Sarah noticed the way he watched her, studying her movements, looking for weaknesses. She had embarrassed him, and men like Harrison didn't forget that kind of humiliation. After the session ended, most of the soldiers filed out, talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. It wasn't every day they saw a SEAL commander taken down by someone half his size. But Harrison lingered, and Sarah could feel trouble brewing. As the last of the regular soldiers left, Harrison approached her again. This time his teammates were with him, 5 other SEALs who looked just as tough and experienced as their commander. The dynamic had shifted. This was no longer a training exercise in front of a mixed crowd. This was starting to feel like a challenge. "That was impressive, Sergeant," Harrison said, his voice carefully neutral. "But I think we both know that was just a demonstration. In a real fight, things would be different." Sarah finished packing up her equipment, not bothering to look at him. "Is that right, Commander?" "Size and strength matter," Harrison continued. "Technique is important. But when push comes to shove, physics wins. A smaller fighter might get lucky once, but Over the long haul, the bigger, stronger opponent has the advantage. Now Sarah did look at him, and she didn't like what she saw. Harrison had that look that men got when their pride was wounded and they needed to do something about it. His teammates were backing him up with their presence, creating an us-versus-them atmosphere that felt dangerous. "Are you suggesting we settle this differently, Commander?" she asked quietly. "I'm suggesting that what happened here today doesn't really prove anything," Harrison replied. "You caught me off guard with some fancy moves, but that's not the same as winning a real fight." The challenge was implicit but clear. Harrison wanted a rematch, but not the controlled demonstration they had just finished. He wanted something more serious, more definitive. Sarah knew she should walk away. This was exactly the kind of situation that could end careers and ruin lives. But something in his tone, in the way his teammates were looking at her like she was some kind of fraud, made her blood boil. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Harrison smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Tomorrow night after hours, just you and me, no holds barred, we settle this properly." Sarah knew she should say no. She knew this was a trap, a no-win situation where she would either get hurt or get in serious trouble for unauthorized fighting. But she also knew that if she backed down now, word would spread throughout the base that she had been intimidated by a SEAL commander. Her credibility as an instructor would be shot, and every tough guy who came through her program would think he could push her around. "Fine," she said. "Tomorrow night, Gym 3 after 2100 hours." Harrison nodded, satisfied. "Don't worry, Sergeant. I'll try not to hurt you too badly." As the SEALs walked away, Sarah realized what she had just agreed to. She had let her pride override her common sense, and now she was committed to a fight that could destroy everything she had worked for. But it was too late to back down now. Word would already be spreading through both units, and by tomorrow night there would be an audience expecting to see the small Army instructor get put in her place by the big Navy SEAL. She finished packing her gear and headed for her quarters, her mind already working on strategy. Harrison was bigger and stronger, but she had advantages too. Speed, technique, and most importantly, motivation. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong, every soldier who had been underestimated because of their size or background. Tomorrow night would determine not just who was the better fighter, but whether she could continue to do the job she loved. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure wasn't an option. Word traveled fast on a military base, especially when it involved a fight between a Navy SEAL commander and an Army combat instructor. By the next morning, everyone from privates to senior NCOs was talking about the upcoming showdown. Sarah tried to go about her normal routine, but she could feel the eyes following her wherever she went. Some looked at her with sympathy, as if she were walking to her execution. Others seemed excited about the spectacle, eager to see whether the small woman who had embarrassed a SEAL could back up her reputation when it really counted. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah taught her regular classes, but her mind kept drifting to the fight ahead. She analyzed every aspect of her encounter with Harrison, looking for clues about his fighting style and weaknesses. He was definitely skilled, but he relied heavily on his size and strength. That kind of fighter often struggled against opponents who could stay mobile and strike from unexpected angles. During her lunch break, she slipped away to one of the smaller training rooms to practice. She worked on her footwork, drilling combinations that would let her stay just outside Harrison's reach while landing quick strikes. She practiced escapes from various holds, knowing that if he managed to get his hands on her, his superior strength could end the fight quickly. As she trained, Sarah thought about her father's words from years ago. "Mija, the biggest mistake a small fighter can make is trying to fight like a big fighter. Use what you have. Be faster. Be smarter. Be unexpected." She had built her entire fighting philosophy around those words, and tomorrow night she would find out if they were enough. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Captain Rodriguez, her commanding officer, appeared at her office door with a concerned expression. He was a fair man who had always supported her, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. "Martinez, I think we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Sarah's heart sank. If Rodriguez knew about the fight, it meant the whole base probably knew. Unauthorized fighting between service members was a serious offense, one that could result in court-martial proceedings. "Sir, if this is about tonight—" "It is," Rodriguez interrupted. "Sarah, what the hell are you thinking? Fighting a SEAL commander? This isn't some barracks boxing match. This could destroy your career." Sarah stared at her hands, knowing he was right, but feeling trapped by her own pride. "He challenged my credibility in front of my students, sir. If I back down now, I'll never be able to maintain discipline in my classes again." Rodriguez sighed heavily. "I understand your position, but there has to be another way. File a complaint, request a transfer, anything but this. With respect, sir, you know how that would look. The female instructor who couldn't handle a little criticism from a male officer. I'd be finished just as surely as if I lost the fight." They sat in silence for a moment, both knowing the impossible situation Sarah found herself in. Finally, Rodriguez spoke again. "I can't officially condone this, you understand. But unofficially, if something were to happen after hours in an unused gymnasium, I might be slow to investigate until morning." Sarah looked up, surprised by his implicit support. "Sir? You're one of the best instructors I've ever worked with, Martinez. I'd hate to lose you over something like this, but if you're determined to go through with it, at least be smart about it. And for God's sake, be careful." After Rodriguez left, Sarah felt both grateful for his support and terrified by the responsibility it placed on her shoulders. She wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was carrying the expectations of everyone who believed in her and the skepticism of everyone who didn't. The evening arrived with the inevitability of a gathering storm. Sarah made her way to Gym 3 at exactly 2100 hours, her stomach tight with nervous energy. The gymnasium was supposed to be empty at this hour, but as she approached the entrance, she could hear voices inside. When she pushed open the door, she was shocked by what she found. Nearly 100 soldiers had somehow squeezed into the space. Word had spread far beyond the initial participants, drawing curious onlookers from across the base. There were Army Rangers and Green Berets, regular infantry soldiers, Navy SEALs, and even a few Marines who had somehow heard about the fight. They had arranged themselves around the edges of the gym, creating an improvised fighting circle in the center. Harrison was already there, wearing PT gear and stretching with casual confidence. When he saw Sarah enter, he straightened up and nodded to her with what might have been respect. The crowd fell silent, tension crackling through the air like electricity. "Last chance to back out, Sergeant," Harrison called across the space. "No one would think less of you." Sarah almost laughed at that. Of course they would think less of her. That was the whole point. She walked to the center of the makeshift ring, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her. "I'm here, Commander. Are you ready?" Harrison rolled his shoulders and stepped forward. Up close. The size difference was even more dramatic. He had at least 90 pounds on her, and his reach advantage was substantial. But Sarah had faced bigger opponents before. The key was not to let his physical advantages dictate the pace of the fight. Someone in the crowd called out, "Time!" and the fight began. Harrison came forward cautiously, having learned from their earlier encounter not to underestimate her. He threw careful jabs, testing her reactions, trying to establish distance and timing. Sarah stayed mobile, circling to her left, away from his power hand, looking for openings. For the first minute, they danced around each other without landing significant strikes. The crowd watched in tense silence, unsure what to expect. Then Harrison committed to a combination, throwing a left hook, followed by a straight right. Sarah slipped the first punch and ducked under the second, coming up inside his guard to land a quick uppercut to his ribs. It was a clean shot, but Harrison barely seemed to notice it. He grabbed for her immediately, trying to use his grappling skills to control the fight. Sarah twisted away from his reaching hands, but not quite fast enough. His fingers caught the fabric of her shirt, and suddenly she found herself in exactly the position she had hoped to avoid, wrapped up in the powerful arms of a much larger opponent. Harrison lifted her off the ground, trying to slam her down onto the gymnasium floor. But Sarah had spent years learning how to escape from disadvantageous positions. Instead of fighting against his strength, she used it, shifting her weight to throw off his balance and simultaneously driving her knee up into his solar plexus. The impact broke his grip and sent them both tumbling to the floor. Sarah rolled away quickly, coming up in a crouch as Harrison struggled to regain his breath. The crowd erupted in surprised shouts, but the fighters were too focused to notice. Harrison got to his feet more slowly this time, and Sarah could see that her strikes were starting to add up. He was favoring his left side slightly, where she had landed the uppercut, and his breathing was heavier, but he was far from finished. "Not bad," he admitted, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "But this is just getting started." He changed tactics then, becoming more aggressive. Instead of careful probing attacks, he launched a series of powerful combinations, using his reach advantage to keep Sarah at a distance where she couldn't counter effectively. She was forced to give ground, weaving and ducking to avoid his heavy hands. One punch got through her defenses, a glancing blow to her temple that sent stars spinning through her vision. The crowd's noise seemed to fade to a distant buzz, and for a moment Sarah felt the floor tilting under her feet. Harrison pressed forward, sensing weakness, but Sarah's training kicked in. She clinched with him, buying time for her head to clear while making it impossible for him to land clean punches. In the clinch, Sarah could feel Harrison's strength advantage most clearly. He was trying to control her movement, to position her for another takedown. But she had learned something important about him during their grappling exchanges. He relied too much on upper body strength and not enough on technique. It was a common mistake among fighters who had always been able to overpower their opponents. Sarah broke the clinch with a short elbow to Harrison's ribs, then immediately attacked his legs with a series of low kicks. Each impact sent shock waves through the muscle, gradually weakening his base and reducing his mobility. Harrison tried to check the kicks, but he wasn't fast enough. Years of carrying heavy gear had made his legs strong, but not quick. The tide of the fight began to turn. Harrison's punches, while still dangerous, were coming slower and with less snap. His footwork became heavier, more labored. Sarah could see the frustration building in his eyes as his superior size failed to give him the decisive advantage he had expected. She began to press her attack, mixing kicks to his legs with quick punches to his body. Each strike was precisely placed, targeting nerve clusters and pressure points that would maximize damage while conserving her energy. This was what years of studying martial arts had taught her: how to fight efficiently, how to make every movement count. Harrison caught one of her kicks and tried to use it to take her down, but Sarah had anticipated this. As he grabbed her leg, she leapt off her standing foot and drove her other knee toward his head. He barely managed to duck, and the knee caught him on the shoulder instead, sending him stumbling backward. The crowd was fully engaged now, cheering and shouting with each exchange. Sarah could hear Army voices encouraging her and Navy voices supporting Harrison, but it all seemed distant and unimportant compared to the man in front of her who was still very much a threat. Harrison reset himself, breathing hard but still dangerous. His left eye was starting to swell from where one of her punches had gotten through, and she could see him favoring his right leg where her kicks had done their work. But he was a Navy SEAL, trained to push through pain and exhaustion, and Sarah knew he wouldn't quit easily. "You're better than I thought," he said, and this time there was genuine respect in his voice. "But I'm not done yet." He came forward one more time, but his approach was different now. Instead of trying to overwhelm her with strength, he was fighting more technically, using better footwork and combinations. It was exactly what Sarah had hoped to avoid, a larger opponent who was also skilled enough to use his advantages properly. The next exchange was the most intense yet. Harrison feinted with his jab and threw a powerful overhand right that Sarah barely slipped. As she moved to counter, he caught her with a left hook that sent her reeling. This time, the punch landed cleanly on her jaw, and for a moment the world went gray around the edges. Sarah found herself on one knee, shaking her head to clear the fog. Harrison stood over her, breathing hard but ready to finish the fight if she couldn't continue. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see if the small instructor could recover from what looked like a fight-ending blow. But Sarah had been hurt before, and she had learned that the most dangerous moment in a fight was when your opponent thought you were finished. As Harrison stepped forward to press his advantage, Sarah exploded upward from her kneeling position, driving an uppercut into his exposed ribs with every ounce of strength she had left. The punch landed perfectly, right between his floating ribs, and Sarah felt something give way under the impact. Harrison's eyes went wide with shock and pain, and he doubled over involuntarily. The sound that came from his mouth was part gasp, part scream, and completely involuntary. Sarah didn't hesitate. As Harrison bent forward from the body shot, she brought her knee up to meet his descending face. The impact was sharp and decisive, snapping his head back and sending him crashing to the gymnasium floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison lay on his back, conscious but clearly hurt, one hand pressed to his ribs and blood trickling from his nose. Sarah stood over him, swaying slightly but still on her feet, her chest heaving from exertion. Slowly, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The small Army instructor had not only survived a fight with a Navy SEAL commander, she had won it decisively. The crowd began to murmur, then cheer, then roar with appreciation for the incredible display of skill and heart they had just witnessed. But Sarah's attention was focused on Harrison. She knelt beside him, her anger replaced by concern for a fellow warrior who had pushed himself to his limits and beyond. "Commander, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Harrison looked up at her, his face a mask of pain and something that might have been admiration. "I think you broke my ribs," he said with a weak smile. "That was impressive." As the crowd began to disperse and someone went to call for medical assistance, Sarah realized that everything had changed. She had proven herself in the most definitive way possible, but she had also made an enemy of one of the Navy's most elite warriors. The consequences of this night would ripple far beyond the gymnasium walls, affecting not just her career, but her entire future in the military. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had won. The medical team arrived within minutes, professional and efficient despite the unusual circumstances of being called to an unauthorized training accident in an empty gymnasium. Harrison had indeed suffered 2 cracked ribs from Sarah's devastating uppercut, along with a moderate concussion from her knee strike. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, he caught Sarah's eye one last time. "This isn't over, Sergeant," he said quietly, but there was something different in his voice. The hostility was gone, replaced by what sounded almost like curiosity. "We need to talk when I get out of medical." Sarah nodded, unsure whether that was a promise or a threat. As the medics wheeled Harrison away, she found herself surrounded by soldiers from both services. The Army personnel were celebrating, slapping her on the back and praising her technique. But the Navy SEALs stood apart, their expressions unreadable. She had defeated their commander, but she suspected that victory might come with a price she hadn't yet calculated. Captain Rodriguez appeared at her elbow, his face a mixture of pride and concern. "Medical will want to check you out too, Martinez. That was quite a hit you took." Sarah submitted to a quick medical examination. which revealed a mild concussion and some bruised ribs, but nothing serious. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full magnitude of what had happened started to sink in. She had fought and defeated a Navy SEAL commander in front of 100 witnesses. The story would spread throughout the military faster than wildfire, but she couldn't predict how different commands would react to the news. Over the next few days, Sarah's life became a whirlwind of unexpected attention. Officers she had never met before stopped by to congratulate her. Training requests came in from units across the base who wanted to learn her techniques. But there were also whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, and she caught more than one group of SEALs watching her with calculating eyes. The official response came down 3 days later. Both Sarah and Harrison were called before a joint Army-Navy review board to explain the training incident that had resulted in Harrison's hospitalization. Sarah had expected this, but she was surprised when Harrison's testimony strongly supported her version of events. He described their encounter as a valuable cross-training opportunity and praised her technical skills. The board seemed satisfied with this explanation, officially classifying the incident as an authorized inter-service training exercise. But Sarah knew the real consequences would be unofficial. The military was a small community where reputation mattered more than rank, and word of her victory over Harrison had already reached the highest levels of both services. Some saw it as proof that size and gender didn't matter if you had enough skill and determination. Others viewed it as an embarrassing defeat for one of their most elite units. A week after the fight, Harrison appeared at her office door. He was moving carefully, his ribs still healing, but his presence filled the small space with the same commanding energy she remembered from their first meeting. This time, however, there was no dismissiveness in his eyes. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected: genuine respect. "Sergeant Martinez," he said formally. "May I come in?" Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk, curious about what he wanted to discuss. Harrison sat down slowly, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his injured ribs. "I wanted to thank you," he said without preamble. Sarah blinked in surprise. "Thank me? For breaking your ribs?" Harrison chuckled, then immediately regretted it as the motion sent pain through his torso. "For teaching me something I should have learned years ago. I've been so used to being the biggest, strongest guy in the room that I forgot there are other ways to fight. Other ways to win." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I came here thinking I was going to teach some Army instructor a lesson about real combat. Instead, you showed me that I've been relying too much on physical advantages and not enough on technique and strategy. That's a dangerous habit in my line of work." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. But Harrison seemed genuinely sincere, even humble in a way she wouldn't have thought possible from their first encounter. "I also wanted to apologize," Harrison continued. "The way I treated you that first day was unprofessional and disrespectful. You had every right to put me in my place, and you did it in the most definitive way possible." "Apology accepted, Commander," Sarah said carefully. "But I have to ask, what happens now? I can't imagine your team is thrilled about what happened." Harrison's expression grew more serious. "You're right, they're not. Some of them see your victory as a fluke, a lucky shot that caught me off guard. Others are angry that you embarrassed the unit. But I've made it clear that anyone who wants to test that theory will have to go through me first." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "The truth is, what you did has sparked some interesting conversations at higher levels. There are people who want to understand how a 130-pound instructor could take down a 220-pound SEAL commander. They're asking questions about training methods, about whether we're preparing our people properly for all types of combat scenarios." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that could lead to opportunities," Harrison replied. or problems, depending on how you handle them. Admiral Peterson wants to meet with you next week. He's the commanding officer for West Coast SEAL operations, and he's very interested in your training methods. The meeting with Admiral Peterson took place in a sterile conference room at the Navy base in San Diego. Sarah had expected a formal interrogation, but instead found herself sitting across from a thoughtful man in his 50s who seemed genuinely curious about her background and techniques. "Sergeant Martinez," Peterson began, "Commander Harrison has given me a detailed account of your encounter. I have to admit, it's not every day one of my SEAL commanders gets taken down by someone half his size." Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond. Peterson continued, "What interests me is not just that you won, but how you won. Harrison is no rookie. He's seen combat in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and he's never been defeated in hand-to-hand combat. Yet you not only beat him, you did it decisively." "I had advantages he didn't expect, sir," Sarah replied carefully. "Speed, technique, and the element of surprise." Peterson nodded. "All important factors. But there's something else, isn't there? Something about your approach to combat that's different from our standard training." Sarah thought for a moment, then decided to be honest. "Most military combat training assumes you'll be fighting opponents roughly your own size and strength. It's designed around the idea that the strongest, fastest fighter usually wins, but that's not always the case in real combat situations." "Explain." "In my neighborhood growing up, the biggest guys weren't always the most dangerous. The really dangerous ones were the fighters who could adapt, who could find ways to use their opponent's strength against them. They fought smarter, not harder." Peterson leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "And you think this approach could be valuable for our people?" "I think it could be valuable for anyone who might face opponents who are bigger or stronger," Sarah said carefully. "Special operations teams sometimes operate in situations where they're outnumbered or outgunned. Being able to neutralize larger opponents quickly and efficiently could save lives." The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, then made a decision that would change everything. "Sergeant Martinez, how would you feel about developing a specialized training program for our people? Something that teaches these adaptation techniques you're talking about?" Sarah felt her heart racing. This was an opportunity she had never imagined, but it was also terrifying. Working with Navy SEALs would put her under intense scrutiny, and any failure would be magnified tenfold. "I'd be honored to try, sir," she replied. The program that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever attempted. Working with Harrison, who had become an unlikely ally, she developed a curriculum that focused on defeating larger, stronger opponents through superior technique and strategy. The initial class consisted of 12 SEAL operators, all volunteers who were willing to learn from the woman who had put their commander in the hospital. The first few sessions were tense. The SEALs were professional but skeptical, clearly testing whether Sarah's victory over Harrison had been a fluke. But as the training progressed, their attitude began to change. Sarah's techniques worked, not just against her, but against each other. They began to see the value in fighting smarter, rather than relying purely on physical superiority. The breakthrough moment came during the third week of training. One of the students, a massive operator named Chief Petty Officer Williams, who stood 6 feet 5 inches and weighed 250 pounds, was sparring with a smaller teammate. Williams had always dominated these sessions through sheer size and strength, but his opponent had been studying Sarah's methods. In a matter of seconds, the smaller SEAL used Williams's own momentum against him, sending the giant crashing to the mat with a perfectly executed throw. Williams lay on his back for a moment, staring at the ceiling in amazement. Then he started laughing, a deep, genuine sound that filled the training room. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, getting to his feet. "That actually works." From that point forward, the SEALs threw themselves into the training with the same intensity they brought to everything else. They practiced Sarah's techniques obsessively, adapting them to their own fighting styles and mission requirements. Word of the program's success began to spread, and soon Sarah found herself fielding requests from other special operations units who wanted similar training. 6 months after her fight with Harrison, Sarah received orders that would take her to the next level of her career. She was being transferred to the Special Operations Command headquarters, where she would develop and oversee combat training programs for all branches of the military. It was a promotion that would have been unthinkable before her encounter with the SEAL commander. On her last day at Fort Bragg, Harrison stopped by her office one final time. He was fully healed from his injuries and preparing to deploy with his team on a classified mission. But he wanted to say goodbye to the woman who had changed his perspective on combat and, in many ways, saved his career. "You know," he said, leaning against her doorframe, "losing that fight was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to become a better operator, a better leader." Sarah looked up from the boxes she was packing. "Any regrets?" Harrison thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Only one. I wish I had been smart enough to listen to you from the beginning instead of having to learn the hard way." As Harrison left for what might be his final mission, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that day when an arrogant SEAL commander had dismissed her as just another small woman trying to play soldier. She had proven that size and strength weren't everything, but more importantly, she had changed minds and saved lives through her knowledge and determination. The story of her victory over Commander Harrison would become legend in military circles, inspiring countless soldiers who had been told they were too small, too weak, or too different to succeed. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't in breaking Harrison's ribs or earning a promotion. It was in proving that sometimes the most important battles are won not through force, but through the courage to stand up and show the world what you're truly capable of. Years later, when young soldiers would ask her about that night in the gymnasium, Sarah would tell them the same thing her father had taught her in that tough Los Angeles neighborhood. It's not about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about being ready when your moment comes and having the courage to seize it. The woman who had once been underestimated by everyone had become one of the most respected combat instructors in the military, and her techniques were being used by elite warriors around the world. But perhaps most importantly, she had opened doors for others who would follow in her footsteps, proving that true strength comes from within, regardless of the size of the package it comes in.